The science is very clear that the faster we reduce emissions, the better our joint future looks like. It's just that simple.
Terms and conditions. The Transsolar podcast for the Biennale Architettura 2025. Episode 5. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Transsolar podcast Terms and Conditions. As in all other episodes, we take the installation about climate change at the entrance of the Architecture Biennale 2025 in Venice as starting point to explore the big picture behind it. Today, we focus on climate science and the question on how to communicate the important messages of climate scientists, and on how to involve the decision makers and the broader public to achieve impact. My guests today are Professor Sonia Seneviratne, renowned climate scientist at the ETH Zurich and board member at the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Professor David Bresch from ETH Zurich too, and David is also an internationally recognized climate scientist. Today, he will share his insights on the economics of climate adaptation. And Alexandra Auer. She's an expert on the communication of data, and she was member of the Transsolar design team of the installation. Thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, hi, Martin.
Pleasure.
The ETH Zurich calculated climate change trends in Venice from the year 2025 to 2100. These data are the basis for the time travel experience in the installation, which brings climate change to life. Sonia, to start with a general question. You are on the IPCC board. What do you do there, and how does the IPCC work? How many people worldwide are involved in the IPCC reports?
Yeah, so I'm part from the IPCC bureau. So it's actually the office of the IPCC, which is in charge of the coordination of the work. So we are about 34 scientists from different regions of the world. So that's more for the coordination. And I'm part of the Working Group 1, which is dealing with physical science. And the main work we do is to coordinate development of reports, which in the end are approved by IPCC, as it's not always clear that the plenary of IPCC, the members are actually the different countries of the world. Mm-hmm. So those reports that are then actually approved by all those different countries, it means the country should know the information included in those reports.
That's a reference point for all countries, for all people now. And I would like to know, where do we stand today with regard to climate change? What do you think, let's say, of the 1.5 degree development?
Yes, so the 1.5 degree limit was set in the Paris Agreement in 2015. Mm-hmm. It's a decision that was made by policymakers. At the time, it was possible to follow a pathway that would allow us to stabilize global warming to 1.5 degrees. Now we are today in 25, unfortunately, emissions have not been going down. We have reached about 1.3 degree of global warming. At the time, we were at about 1 degree. And we know that if we continue every year to accumulate more CO2 in the atmosphere, we'll reach 1.5 degree in about 29. Okay. So a really important point there is that CO2, once emitted, stays in the atmosphere. It doesn't disappear. So it's a problem that gets worse with every emission.
So we have a clear message from the scientists. And Alex, you are a data communication specialist. Please, what is your idea about that, and how does the broader public and also the decision makers perceive this?
I mean, I hope everyone has heard about the 1.5 degree at some point. And I do think it is in the head of decision makers and has been. I mean, there's a lot of measures that we take to become more resilient to climate change and also to prevent the possible consequences. However, I do think with the pressing other crises that are going on in the world, which we very much experience every day, like the war in Ukraine or the consequences of the pandemic, which we really felt in our society, I do unfortunately think that the climate crisis has been being pushed to the background a little bit.
So I think the communication has really a key role in all this. And David, you are dealing with the question of the field of economics of climate change. And what does it mean in the general sense? Because I think here could be really a strong push from this field.
I mean, the science is very clear that the faster we reduce emissions, the better our joint future looks like. It's just that simple. And as Sonia said, well below 2 degrees. That was the story in Paris, and not how we kind of make it somewhere around that number. And a couple absolutely crucial support systems for human life are threatened even at 1.5 degrees, like coral reefs, the bleaching and all of these. And so what I also look into is the impacts of climate change on socio-economic systems. And I look at economics. What does it take to prevent further damage? How we can be better prepared against extremes, disasters, be it droughts, floods, storms, wildfires. I mean, it comes at a cost. And so we look at the cost, basically that the effort it takes to prevent something from happening, and then compared to what the benefit would be of that prevention in terms of reducing the impact. And what we learn up to order of these 2 degrees, and that's why this number is so pivotal, a lot of things in many parts of the world can be cost effectively managed. It doesn't come for free. Beyond that, in many places, it gets very difficult. And the sad story is those who didn't cause the problem firsthand, Global South and other highly exposed communities, they are more exposed. And it does remind us that it's already now much cheaper to reduce emissions than to invest in adaptation. But since we can seem not to be able to agree as humankind on this issue to really take strong action, then the second best option is adaptation, but it clearly has its limits.
Mm-hmm. And I think economy is really a big level for the communication. And before you started working at the ETH, you worked for an insurance company, the worldwide, I think, biggest insurance company or reinsurance company, Swiss Re. And they are dealing with damages and with money. What is the discussion there in this field of economics?
It's, for many years, was the second biggest. So Munich Re is even a tiny bit bigger. But to have a good market, you need competition. So it's a couple of those big ones. And they really globally try to diversify risk. And they can do so if they understand what drives risk and if they have a clear view on what might drive risk going forward. And that was the reason to embark on these studies and also to inform clients. But that's not only smallholder businesses and so on. It's also to inform and engage in dialogue with larger communities up to the level of states to find ways also on a policy level how to look into that in a forward-looking fashion. And that allowed us not only to look at emission scenarios, climate scenarios, impact scenarios, but also adaptation scenarios. And as I said, they have these limits that at some stage it gets so tremendously difficult. If you have to build a very high sea dike to prevent wave action, you might have no tourism behind. And that's what basically drives your economy. So your business model comes to an end. And then there's no reason to provide insurance. So it's much earlier than that to think about, are ecosystems there to help us mitigate some of these risks? Are other ways to deal with risk in a community ways to do so? Is a more systemic view at an economy probably a way out of it? These were the questions we've deliberated for many years in the company. And we always resolved to the point, we have to tackle the root cause, and that means reduce emissions.
But how do the CEOs react in the big companies you're talking of?
Yeah, that's a very tough question. It's even so, companies do have strategies. They normally do not extend beyond the horizon of 2 to 3, maximum 5 years. And there is this strategy of the horizon, as Mark Carney said in a seminal speech just prior to Paris as the governor of the Bank of England. He said, there is a tragedy of the commons that we have to manage air quality, water quality. We do now understand that since the 70s, a lot of progress has been made. But the tragedy of the horizon that we should think about decades and the implications of what we do today has and will stay, as Sonia said, the CO2 stays in the atmosphere, has implications for generations to come. And we do not take that seriously enough in our decision making. And that's why my humble contribution is through the adaptation cost link to say there will be impacts hard to finance. And therefore, it's not as easy as some of the global assessment models tell us, we can find an optimum at some level of warming. That often means a lot of people will suffer and a few will still be well off. And so that is also a very deep conversation about justice. And we have seen in the recent past the CEOs, reminded by the public, they basically operate on a mandate. You cannot operate a company which is just bad and evil to society. So they have to also respect that one. And that often integrates that thinking into strategic decision-making of large companies. But it is a trade-off, and it's a tough decision to make, because if you're the only one and your competitors still benefit of, say, outdated business model, you might be out of business before your new products might even have a grasp.
Of course.
So that's why, at the end, what they do a lot, if you're really a conscious business leader, you have to advocate for the boundary conditions to help you to prevail.
And I think for many people, and also for the business leaders, it is an abstract discussion. Yeah, you see charts of climate change and so on, and you cannot feel it. And the installation at the Biennale, it makes climate change tangible and feelable. And let's go for a moment to this installation, and not so much to the installation itself, but to the calculations that you've done for Venice. What is it really with these 42 degrees?
Well, 42 degrees is just a typical temperature we would have in summer there, but it could be also even much more, and basically under this worst case scenario. So the worst case scenario would be a one in which we have a global warming of a bit more than 4 degrees, and we are basically not decreasing our emissions. Of course, in single days already now, we can have about 42 degrees, and in the future, we could have in single days much higher temperatures. But it's basically to convey what it means to be in such a temperature, and to reach the visitors in those type of conditions that they might be exposed to. So it's, instead of having just those numbers in the report that you might be reading, you basically feeling it with your own body.
And how do you model the change of temperature?
To make it very simple, when we emit CO2, mostly because of the burning of fossil fuel, we have then greenhouse gas. Those greenhouse gas lead to more radiation being trapped on the Earth. So it leads to a general warming of the Earth. But then the general temperatures that is happening in a location will be affected by this overall warming, but also advection of heat, and also other processes that, for instance, how much drying you might have in a region is also important. And then this change in temperature also affect how much glaciers are melting and the expansion of the sea, so that would be affecting sea level rise. So we have a representation of all those different processes, and now they are affecting a range of different change in climate extremes.
And there's a second aspect in the installation. It's a rise of sea level that we can see. It is 70 centimeters. David, maybe you can talk a little bit about this. What is the effect of 70 centimeters of sea level rise in Venice?
I mean, in the design phase, we thought about exposing visitors to the real wet conditions. But now they walk through on a path where they are immersed in a 70 centimeter water table. But what we do not perceive are the indirect effects, and they are much more severe. One we still often talk about is the damage it does to cultural heritage, like the mosaics in the cathedral and other things that are precious to us because they have a history, they tell a story, and that story might be gone if this happens too often and the damage gets too widespread. But then it's also the indirect effects on how we cope with issues. Think about the hospital and the hospital work, the caretakers. Not all of them live in a hospital 5 meters above sea level. They have to commute in and out of Venice every day because they cannot afford living in the city anymore. So another story to be told. And then if you have to close Mose several times a week, or even several times a month, it gets a bit hard to vent the whole lagoon, which is a very, very complex and intricate ecosystem. And then you might have stagnant water. You might issues about vector disease not being kind of flushed out anymore. And all these indirect effects we normally underestimate. That was hard to convey, but we felt by putting people in this room, which is dark, loud, getting warmer, and there's even this wet kind of experience around you, gets you a bit of a feel of what you would look like.
Yes. But if I understand it right, the installation doesn't show all. So you said there will be diseases because of the quality of water and so on. So Alex, you have been part of the design team. Maybe you should have put some bacteria in it. I don't know what.
I don't know how we could have argued for that. I mean, even the smell, we already were thinking about if we can somehow produce the smell that would be there. We couldn't do that.
And, Alex, also the design team, I think they were not aware that the mosquitoes would come.
Yeah, I wonder what it looks like when the Biennale will close. We should take some final pictures then. But of course, we had to simplify all these findings and all these scenarios that we got from ETH to translate it into this installation. And with the Biennale, we had a very specific target group. So it was clear, okay, we're doing this for architects, people who work in the field of architecture. And then with the air conditioning, you have this object that speaks volumes, right? Because it stands for comfort, but it stands for comfort on a very high cost, and a very high cost of electricity, and on a very high cost now when we talk about climate change. And this comfort can only exist on we always said, on the back of others, because in order for one room to be cool, the hot air needs to go somewhere else. And that was the entrance room. So through this metaphor and this picture of the also very ugly air conditioning, I mean, architects all have this idea of aesthetics, and the old air conditioner is definitely not part of this idea. So through this metaphor, I think we were able to simplify scientific findings, yes, but still convey a very strong message.
David, you have also a lot to do with the people, with stakeholders, decision makers, and so on. How important is, let's say, scenario building, or how important is this kind of storytelling for your business?
I mean, the number one, we're humans. I mean, the number one is dialogue. Engage in a conversation. I often don't mention the climate in my title. I just say weather risks. And then people are always open, independent of their political background, of their educational background, to talk about weather. And then sometimes it's rather they ask me, what do you think about climate change? And I ask back, hey, did you ever feel it? Have you a story to tell? And that engages. And I think that's what we try here to engage in an experience, in a story you can relate to, which doesn't finger point, it doesn't blame, it just first is almost an independent, with a sobering experience. And then you start to ask this question, who benefits, who pays the bill, what are the implications of it? That's absolutely crucial. So for me, it depends a lot on with whom you talk, and to try to first attune into a conversation. And it could sometimes be, it's not the first conversation in which one you can really tackle the issue. You have to build trust, because otherwise you're just shut out and then you didn't achieve anything. So it's a very delicate balance to strike, even more so as an ETH professor sometimes, because you come with a hat on, and that hat on is not always very helpful, because sometimes people think I studied physics, so he must know something better. But no, about deeper questions of life, I have just the same experience, opinion as everybody else. And that's very connected.
I can imagine that's really an important point, just to build up the trust at the beginning. Yeah. And Alex, maybe you can give us an example how to work with these techniques to convey the messages of climate scientists.
Yes, so I do this kind of storytelling, especially in urban settings for municipalities. And one thing that we have found is that it's extremely impactful to create scenarios where the people themselves can find themselves in. So, for example, when we talk about very simple measures to also tackle climate change, but they also have other consequences, like, for example, reducing the speed in a street, right? It can have different effects on the air quality, and it can have effects on the sound, and it affects then again people differently. So when you create these scenarios, it's really important to create different scenarios for different target groups. There might be a student that lives in a tiny flat right at the main street, and for them it's really, really nice if the air quality gets better, because then they can sit on the balcony longer and they can have their window open at night because there's less noise. But then again, maybe for people who don't live on the main street, but some other streets further down, they can't access their street as easily anymore with their cars. So you have all these different consequences, and you need to display them all so that people can weigh their options. I think that's really the most important part, to inform people enough so that they know how to weigh their options.
So you build scenarios and you make a personalization so that people can identify with certain, let's say, ways that we want to go. Or decisions that we make. Sonia, how's it for you? In the field of climate science, I can imagine it's difficult because you have on the one side the reliability and accuracy of science. On the other side, you want to have an impact. And if you start storytelling, it is sharpening an argument. And it's not easy to keep this balance. How is the discussion? What is your personal opinion about this storytelling in climate science? And how are the discussions in your community?
Well, certainly the question of storytelling is getting more traction in the climate community because we have very clear information from the climate science, but the main issue is now no longer about where we stand and what are the issues. It's basically about getting society to do something about it. And that's why communication is absolutely essential. I think the starting point is very accurate, very robust science. But then we have to find ways to convey this information. And an installation like the one in Venice is one way for people to receive this information in a different way, maybe to also reach a different type of people, those that are not reading IPCC reports. And again, basically the community reading IPCC reports is quite limited. So it's also about reaching to other people maybe have not thinking about this every day.
And I think it's possible also, Alex and David, to have different depths of information.
Yes, I mean, with the installation in the first room, we really opened up a scenario. We let people experience what Venice might be like in 2100. And then we, of course, also had information that accompanied the installation. There was a website where you could find the scientific report. So we had these layers of information for the different groups and the different depths of interest. But I think what was also really important is to see the Biennale also in the entire exhibition, because we opened up a scenario and then in the following rooms there were approaches to solve this issue. And I think when you see that full picture, you have the problem in the first room and then possible solutions in the other rooms. That also creates another depth of information, because then we don't only open up problems, but we also, in that case, other exhibitors try to solve them.
But I do need to mention on this, and this was mentioned by David before, the main solution is about stopping emissions. And the emissions do not only happen in buildings, they happen also in transport. So also having people flying to the Biennale is maybe not ideal. So, we need to be aware of the solutions. Some of the solutions I presented at Biennale solution was speaking of maybe adaptation option. Also, how can you reduce emissions in buildings? But then we need to be aware the solutions are in the end about moving away from fossil fuel. That's a key point. It's a really important message.
That's true. And if we think of the people in the local authorities, they are some kind of project managers of this transformation process. How can we support them? This is one question. The second is, how can we get some kind of change process in these local authorities, in these administrations? David, yeah?
Basically, I think what we should all work together to expand the span of control and to allow to set the system boundaries as always as possible and as wide as you can, because then all of a sudden solutions come to the table. Urban planning can do a lot. But if you have basically that being set, and then the developers can only on a small patch of land do something, and they probably have a lot of things to comply with, then their maneuvering space gets smaller. And also then the problem that often the builder is not the owner, is not the occupant, is not the one who takes it away later. And that all basically makes it harder to think holistically. And what I often see in public procurement is that some of the public procurement rules are really driven to cost efficiency.
Yeah.
And that's not effectiveness.
Yeah.
So in my time in office, I can build a cheap school. But then when it gets warmer, it's hard to learn in there. And it's not to just then put, exactly, that's the installation twist, right? It's not an idea to put an air conditioning unit in. It's a design question. And there are schools, even in Bangladesh, which work at ambient temperatures. We have a hard time to breathe because they're vented well. Some even float with the river. And so they are totally resilient to flooding. And some of these schools, the learning experience is much deeper. It speaks to more senses than just one part of the brain. So that's probably, and I interpret here a bit widely, but I think that was a bit of the spirit also of this Biennale. To open us all or our minds up to say, hey, there are other ways to do so. Even Frank Lloyd Wright in the 60s did build in the desert without air conditioning. You just have to basically listen to the nature around you.
There's a lot of solutions present, and
yes,
but we need public administrations and decision makers to listen to them. And they certainly listen to them at some point, but if the benefits are beyond their legislation period, it becomes hard to argue why they should maybe build a school that's more expensive if they cannot earn the benefits, but maybe 2-3 generations after. And I think that's where this impactful communication of science comes in again, and that we don't only target public citizens, that we don't only target architects, but that we also think about how do we need to communicate to politicians and maybe to public administrations to guide them on how to manage these solutions that exist or approaches to the problem. Yeah,
absolutely. And there's another podcast episode with Christine Lemaitre from the DGNB, and she's explaining about the initiative Shift. And this initiative is learning with and from the South. So there will be a lot of examples of other countries, other areas, how to make buildings in a more climate-sensitive way. Sonia, what are your experiences?
I think from what I've seen, the politicians, they react also a lot to pressure from the citizens. So having this, realization within the general public, within the population would make a huge difference. So for me, of course, I mean, some politicians might go and attend the Biennale, but in the end, it's also about basically awakening those broader public and everybody, different type of citizen. And just as information is really reaching everybody.
Mm-hmm. Maybe last question in this respect. Some people said, hey, we should have this installation also in other major cities, that people, that decision makers can have this experience. What would be a good idea to show it and also to develop the concept a bit further?
Yeah.
Alex, maybe you'd like to start.
We need to, I think, remind ourselves that the reason why public administrations communicate, and they aim to communicate transparently, is because they're required to do so. I'm not saying that they also don't want to communicate transparently, but they are required to do so because as the citizens, we need to understand their actions. So we need to know which information they had and why they decided to do something a certain way. So now when we think about this installation and how it could be implemented into municipalities and how citizens can experience it, but also decision makers can experience it, we could maybe think about if we can model different scenarios, right? So maybe you go in and you experience your town the way it would feel in 2100 if we don't change anything. And then we would have these certain numbers, you would have the temperature. And then another scenario could be that certain actions were taken and you can experience your town again in 2100, and it might be cooler or it might be even hotter because you took the wrong actions were taken. So that would be one way. And then another thing that would be important is to, if this installation would move to another town, to also present some actions that politicians can take so that we don't only communicate in terms of problems, but also present some approaches to the problem.
Solutions.
Yeah.
And again, this, what you said earlier about the personalization, in the communication you can take certain persons and show what is the effect then, and what is the effect in the business life, economics. Sonia, what would be an important point to make an adaptation of the installation if you, let's say, go to Geneva or to another Swiss city?
Yeah, well, I think you could have adaptation of different type. If it were in Switzerland, of course, sea level is less of an issue, but we might have some rocks falling down, so which is also actually quite challenging. And unfortunately, we just had a terrible such event in Switzerland, just before the summer. So I guess beside the temperature is universal. Temperature is increasing everywhere. Heat waves are increasing almost in every location, but there are those additional risks that are increasing in different ways in different locations. And in Switzerland, I would say, definitely rock falls from the mountains, but also increasing risk of droughts. It's also relevant in the Mediterranean. Obviously, there are huge impact of droughts, risk of fires, what we are saying right now. Unfortunately, we should say it doesn't require that much projection. Some of those changes, we are seeing them right now. I must say, when I see right now the news, also of this summer, wildfires happening across the Mediterranean. We are saying it's already a dystopia right now, but the point is it's going to be much worse if we don't manage to stabilize global warming. So when people ask me, isn't it too late? It's too late to avoid a lot of the impact we could have avoided if we had acted earlier. But it's not too late to avoid the situation getting even worse and losing even more. You just need to be aware of that.
I think, Sonia, this is a perfect word to end on. I really enjoyed our discussion about how to convey the important messages of climate scientists. From a solid scientific basis, we can develop scenarios that show concretely how people will be affected. From this, we can address specific stakeholders in a personal and easy-to-understand way. We have seen how it is relevant to transform data into stories to have an impact. This is really important, and thank you, Sonia, David, and Alex, for sharing your perspectives and experiences with us.
Thank you.
Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you, Martin.
Pleasure.
Yeah.
Thanks.
You've been listening to Terms and Conditions, the Transsolar podcast, brought to you by Transsolar Energietechnik and TUM, Chair of Building Technology and Climate Responsive Design. Production by Prösler Studio. In the next episode, we look at the collaboration with the artists from the Michelangelo Pistoletto team.